The BBC is scheduled to telecast the second chapter of its contentious documentary on Prime Minister Modi, but the debate around it refuses to die down. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Now remember, the government has dismissed the BBC documentary on the Prime Minister as malicious propaganda reflective of a colonial mindset. In fact, India has blocked the airing of this documentary in our country, and it has also asked social media platforms like Twitter to block links that lead to it. However, opposition members, at least some of them, are challenging the government on this diktat. In fact, some of them are deliberately and mindfully sharing links to this documentary. The documentary has been dismissed by supporters of the government, but even by several prominent British Indian members as reflective of stereotyping India by a country that some say hasn't got over its colonial mindset. Others are arguing that this is less about colonialism and more about censorship. Coming up in a couple of minutes from now, we have a very, very interesting newsmaker today. In my opinion, he's been one of the most effective and powerful anti-colonial voices. Shashi Tharoor, as an author, diplomat, and now a Congress member of Parliament, has often taken on the British. He's argued for reparations. He's called Winston Churchill a genocidal dictator. He's accused the British Raj of being responsible for the deaths of 35 million Indians. But how will he, as a liberal, as a member of the opposition, but also as a proud Indian, navigate the many contradictory strains that actually emerge from this debate? Let's find out by going across to Dr. Tharoor live. He's joining us from his constituency this evening. So we're grateful to him for making the time in the middle of a busy evening. There's a lot to unpack here. And when I asked you or requested you for your time on this, I was struck by the irony of where you might weigh in as someone who's been a ferocious, trenchant critic of the British Raj, of its colonial mindset, of its refusal to offer the apologies even for massacres like Jallianwala Bagh. And today, this storm around a BBC documentary that the government and the foreign ministry, and may I remind you, you've served as a diplomat in that ministry, dismiss as reflective of a colonial mindset. How do you see the documentary?
There's a lot there, as you said, Barkha. I mean, the problem, I think, is not so much colonialism, though I do accept the point that in India, this is something that happened 21 years ago, that the Supreme Court has ruled on, and that people, including Muslims, feel we now should put behind us. So if India has moved on from this tragedy without in any way casting aspersions on those who believe that the full truth was not indeed revealed by the official investigations. Nonetheless, if we moved on, why should a foreign television channel open the old wounds is a fair question. But I wonder whether to a great extent the problem was not the reaction of the government to the BBC documentary. Because if the government hadn't gone over the top in condemning it, thereby drawing attention to something which wasn't otherwise available in India, if they then hadn't started censoring it, taking it off YouTube, taking it off every other means of accessing it in India, perhaps this entire overreaction need not have drawn so much attention, and India could indeed have moved on. I mean, I was a bit bemused by the vehemence of the government's reaction, because frankly, my own gut instinct would have been that a mature democracy could simply have ignored it and said, you know, people can say what they like. We've got more important things to deal with in today's India. And that might have been a more mature way of moving on. So I was a bit surprised, I have to say, by the government reaction, because it had predictably what's called the Streisand effect. You know, when Barbara Streisand tried to suppress something about her, it became news, and everyone who wouldn't otherwise have paid attention to it did. In this particular instance, the government has drawn attention to all the debates and the controversies about what happened in Gujarat 21 years ago. And frankly, that, I think, may well have kept this controversy alive in a much bigger way.
So let me try and unpack what you've just said. What I'm hearing you say is that there is something a little jarring about a foreign TV channel telling Indians, what we should apparently think about something that has been much debated, argued over, and indeed dealt with by India's top court, which exonerated the Prime Minister, among others. That is one side, and you can see the criticism of that. But what you don't agree with is how the government has chosen to handle the documentary. So
That's
let's say they hadn't blocked the documentary. Let's say they hadn't blocked links to it or ordered that. What would you have felt about this, the fact of this documentary?
Well, frankly, I'm not sure that I would have made the time to see it. I've read a lot of Indian journalists' accounts of what happened in Gujarat. I don't think that I would necessarily have needed one more hour to read again a number of charges that are very familiar to me and to most Indians who follow the news very carefully. Even though I was abroad when that happened and I wasn't in Indian politics, it was impossible to escape reading about all of this. And after I came back to India, more material came out. There were a couple of good books on the whole issue, and I think we all know that there is a very strong indictment made by many people who feel that the attempts to close the case have not fully gone into some of the things that went wrong. Now, we know all of that. We have now decided, nonetheless, that we have to live with today's reality. We can't keep living in 2001. And even some Indian Muslims. 2002, we're now in 2023, 21 years ago. So, I mean, I think there are even some Indian Muslims who feel that way. Whether this issue should have been allowed to suddenly dominate discourse in our country, I think that's where the government erred in its manner of reacting. Because, the two principal arguments, there are three really, but two that the government made, was number one, that it undermines the sovereignty and integrity of India, and the other was that it's a possible that showing the documentary would be a possible threat to public order. Now, both of those arguments, I think, actually show India and the Indian government in a very poor light, because frankly, our sovereignty is not so fragile that a BBC documentary can undermine it. And what is it in this that challenges our sovereignty over our territory, over our country, over our constitution, over our people? There's nothing there that I could see. I mean, if they mean that the fact that we have discovered that the British diplomats posted in India at that time went and conducted an investigation into an internal affair of India, but frankly, that's no news to any of us. We knew that every embassy was trying to find out what happened, particularly embassies of countries whose nationals may have been caught up in the events in Gujarat at that time. So the truth is that what they're doing is what we would do if tomorrow Indians were killed in a riot in England. Our embassy would look into it, as I believe it did, our High Commission did in England during the recent Leicester riots. It's normal practice for countries to investigate. So there is no assault on sovereignty involved for a country's diplomat to look into something that affects his own nationals. And there wouldn't be if India sent a diplomat to Leicester to talk to people about what happened during the riots there recently. It's exactly the same principle. So I don't think that the BBC or the British government can undermine our sovereignty. My sense of our sovereignty is not that it's so fragile. The second argument they make, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just interject you briefly to reiterate the essence of what you're arguing? I think you are saying that many Indians, irrespective of political ideology, might feel rankled by the essential asymmetry of power when it comes to a Western gaze on India, a kind of singular brushstroke on 1.4 billion people, repeatedly telling the India story in the same way. That might have irritated you as well. That you agree with. So to that extent, you're not speaking as a congressman here opposed to the BJP. But as a liberal, you don't like blocking out the broadcast or the sharing of a film, even if you disagree, as you appear to do, with the kind of assumptions that the film seems to fall back on.
Well, I mean, the assumptions are essentially irrelevant. I mean, the facts that they're reporting is there was an investigation conducted by British diplomats posted in India at that time. They sent a confidential report, which the BBC has now got hold of. And in that report, they claim that the truth is much worse than the government of India publicly acknowledged at that time, or that the Supreme Court acknowledges today. So essentially, they seem to be saying here is a version that our people on the spot at that time believed. Now, you can ask yourself, why should this be coming 21 years after this happened? Why is it the BBC's business to reopen this, etc.? These are all some of the challenges that people have been casting. What I said was we could have ignored that. It's not something that the Indian government needed to have reacted to in this fashion. It certainly is unacceptable for the Indian government to go around banning, censoring, getting things removed off the internet, trying to prevent people from screening it, because that is censorship that really has no place in a democracy. How does the government justify its censorship? It gives two reasons. Number one, that it affected the sovereignty and integrity of India. I've explained why I don't agree with that and why our sovereignty is not so fragile. The second reason it said is they had to block the documentary because if it was shown, it would threaten national security and public order. Now, that is again rather worrying, because what are we saying? That a documentary made by a BBC channel can actually threaten our national security and public order? I mean, that puts us in a very poor light as a stable democracy if we can't even manage to digest a documentary that says unpleasant things about us. So to my mind, both the grounds given by the government for censorship are extremely pathetic grounds. They're not grounds that we should have indulge in any way. And I must say that I agree with those who believe that this censorship has been an own goal, that it has been self-defeating for the government to go into this. As I said earlier in our conversation, Barkha, the government, if I had anything to do with it, it was my party in power and something like this came up, I would have simply ignored it. And if asked, I would say everyone has a right to say what they want. In our country, we've debated this thoroughly. The Supreme Court has ruled on it. We're moving on. Next question. End of story. I mean, why this government chose to react so childishly is something that totally surprises me.
Okay, childish reaction is how you dub the government's response. But let me, you said if it were up to you, if this were your government, may I say respectfully, your government doesn't have, or your party rather, doesn't have the best record on free speech. But we'll park that for just a second, because before you were a politician, you were a diplomat.
That's
right. And so let's imagine.
I was an international civil servant, but anyway.
All right. But you have, among the ministries you've served as, even as a Congress minister, is the foreign ministry, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what Shashi Tharoor in the foreign ministry would do today, and how you would reconcile this with your very, very strong feelings about the British Raj, right? We cannot decontextualize this conversation. So just for the benefit of our audience, I want to pick up on our screen 2-3 things that you've said, over the years about the Raj. You have likened Churchill to a genocidal dictator for his role in the Bengal famine. That's an image of you, I think, from Australia Broadcasting Television. Subsequently, or I don't know, maybe I get the timeline wrong, but I know separately at an Oxford Union debate, you've spoken a lot about the reparations that the empire owes. And you argued that it's rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, and maim people for 200 years and then celebrate that they are democratic at the end of it all. And you have often argued that for Jallianwala Bagh, you're waiting for the day that a British Prime Minister will come to Jallianwala Bagh, go down on his or her knees and beg forgiveness. Now, this is what Shashi Tharoor, thinks about the Raj, that you have also accused of the deaths, of being complicit in the deaths of 35 million Indians. Then comes from a taxpayer-subsidized broadcasting platform, this documentary about an Indian prime minister. Forget for a moment your Congress, he's BJP, you disagree with his politics, etc. You're in the foreign ministry. What would you do?
Look, I mean, I wouldn't grant to the British the power to shake me up so much with something like this domestically. Now, if I were in the Foreign Office, I've already said what I would say, and I would have said it in a dismissive manner in order not to give it importance. But I will say to you that honestly, this has nothing so much to do with colonialism. Here are the Brits making a documentary for a domestic audience about a domestic situation. And that domestic situation is one of a certain, shall we say, painful incident that happened in our country, in which they can claim a legitimate interest. There are Gujarati Muslims living in Britain who may have a legitimate interest in watching a documentary about this. They live in Britain, so BBC showing this documentary to them is reasonable. Our objections are, to my mind, the following. One is, it's none of your business, but that's a very difficult argument to make, because just as we feel entitled to comment on injustices, say, in apartheid South Africa when it happened in those days, similarly, they can say they have every right to
I know, but yet you've acknowledged that the Supreme Court did exonerate the Prime Minister. You've acknowledged this is something that is 20 years old that our institutions have dealt with. Go ahead.
So, Barkha, I'm just going through it point by point. So, one is none of their business. Second, that as far as India is concerned, the Supreme Court has ruled, and that's the final word, and therefore we accept that final word. The third point would be that, as far as we are concerned, as Indians, we have moved on. Don't rake up old wounds. Those kinds of things. But I think that if the objective is not to let the British get under your skin, then it seems to me that the best way not to do that is to ignore it and to say to them essentially, we've dealt with this, the matter is over. So the British are now catching up 20 years late. That's their problem. Can we talk about something else? We have more important things to deal with today. It's become a live political issue in India today because the government has reacted the way it has. And now the issue is no longer so much about colonialism or about the British saying nosy things about us, very frankly. It is also about censorship and about our government's overreaction to unflattering statements about itself. To be very, very honest, I do feel that the government has erred 3 times over in the time that I've been aware of it. They have erred in overreacting to the WHO, challenging the COVID numbers we've had in our country. They have erred in overreacting to Nara Lapid, the Israeli journalist, condemning the Kashmir files, and they've overreacted the most to this BBC documentary. I think they've got to learn to be a little less thin-skinned. If we are an ancient civilization and a mature democracy, we can take all this in stride. We've taken far worse in stride over the years. For God's sake, we don't need to sit around reacting in this manner to every slight, real or imagined.
So do you think the government should have just ignored the documentary? Let whoever
That's
wanted
right.
to watch it, hate it, like it, whatever, doesn't matter.
Whatever. Yeah, it would have created a debate like so many debates we've had. We've had debates on social media and mainstream media and everything in India, including on the Kashmir files itself, on other issues. Let it be. Let people have different opinions. In fact, this is a government that has made an art of encouraging controversies to distract people from things like unemployment and inflation and so on. Controversies are actually grist to the mill for the government. They could have, if it had come to that, do that. But the government, as a government, need not have been a participant in the controversy. They could have taken the line I suggested and just, as far as they were concerned, act as if it's too trivial for the government of India to concern itself with. Instead, they've been invoking sovereignty. They've been saying threat to national security and public order. Are we some sort of fragile, fledgling republic that we can't manage our national security because the BBC makes a documentary? Is our sovereignty so fragile that a foreign television channel can undermine our sovereignty? I find that as an Indian offensive. I'm sorry. I stand for a much more robust idea of my own country, my own state, and what we're worth. We're not so easily undermined by others.
So, but may I say that the points you've made are very, very excellent points, except that no party in power seems to actually emulate these principles. The fact is that we have under the Congress, you were not a member of it then, emergency. You have, movies like Andhi being banned. You have Madhur Bhandarkar, who recently tweeted to Rahul Gandhi saying, good that you stand up for movies, but when it came to my film, Congress workers came and disrupted it. You have Mamata Banerjee's
Which film was that?
Hindu Sarkar. Hindu Sarkar. You have today's headlines in the Indian Express talking about a professor who was jailed in West Bengal for a cartoon or a post or something. You have in Maharashtra someone who went to jail for a post about Sharad Pawar. So what I'm trying to say is everybody makes these great points about free speech, and then when they're in power at whatever level, they don't seem to implement them. So, can anyone afford the high moral ground among politicians on free speech?
Well, I'm speaking entirely personally. Remember, I'm not a spokesman of the Congress Party. So since my own track record is I've taken a heck of a lot of nonsense about myself, and I have neither made a song and dance about it, nor tried to sort of go after the perpetrators particularly. I have tried to keep a dignified silence and ignored much of it. I would say that what I've recommended is, I think, the right course of action for the government of India. The government of India thinks otherwise, they're entitled to. But I do believe that this overreaction has actually ill-served the cause of what our government should care about, which is indeed standing for Indian pride and Indian sovereignty, security, whatever.
If you were in England and asked about this documentary, we all have this the sense that we'll argue at home, but we unite outside. And a lot of great democracies have this sentiment.
Of course
If
we
you
do.
were outside,
Yeah.
if you were outside and you were asked about this, what would you say?
No, I would say pretty much the same thing. That listen, this is a debate we've had in India. It's a very important debate we've had in India, and it's one in which obviously there are some irreconcilable positions. But let's face it, what happened 21 years ago. Our country has chosen to move on. We are anxious to heal the divisions in our country and to try and have a united and inclusive India. So I don't particularly wish to enter into this controversy now, something along those lines, and move on from there. If I were, but I'm speaking as an individual and as an opposition MP. If I were a government spokesman, as I said, I would have nipped it in the bud in India itself by taking the stand that I recommended. I just think that we have needlessly, by now I'm saying the government of India has needlessly created an issue that has essentially now become much more about censorship than it is about any sort of foreign interference. And in doing so, it has also undermined our own self-respect by talking about a foreign documentary undermining our sovereignty or threatening our national security. I will never grant to any foreign documentary the capability of undermining my country's sovereignty or threatening my national security. I'm sorry, we are much too big, much too strong, and much too sovereign for that.
Yeah, I have just a couple of minutes left with you, so I have two final questions. One is,
Sure.
There's this image of you presenting one of your books to the Prime Minister. It created a lot of speculation at that time, and there it is. I think a lot of people are curious. What is your relationship like with the Prime Minister? This is about the British Empire in India, and that's why it struck me to ask about this moment when you presented your book on the British Empire to the Prime Minister in the context of everything we're debating today.
Well, look, I mean, that particular time, it was the right thing to do because the Prime Minister had actually been gracious enough to refer to my speech at the Oxford Union when I made it and to say it was the right thing at the right time and so on. And in fact, I had worked with his speechwriters when he went to England after that to calibrate the way in which he might address this issue had it come up. So I will say that very, very clearly on this issue, the Prime Minister and I didn't have any significant difference of opinion, except on one issue, which is I denounced 200 years of colonialism, and he speaks of 1200. And I've told him that I don't agree with him on that, because I do believe that what came before the British was what stayed in India. Obviously, I'm not referring to those who pillaged and looted and left the country. Those were foreign raiders. But those who came here and stayed here and lived here and married here and assimilated here are our people. They're not foreign rulers. So I don't consider that to be 1200 years of foreign colonial rule. But the 200 years of British colonial rule, I think we largely agree. Otherwise, frankly, I don't think the Prime Minister has any illusions about where I stand on the political issues dividing our parties, and particularly on the question of what I tend to dub as inclusive India. I believe in an India that stands for every single person in this country, irrespective of their religion, their language, the region they're from, and so on. Whereas I believe that the BJP, by its advocacy of Hindutva, of Hindu Rashtra, of the Hindi language, and so on, is needlessly dividing the country. So between my version of what India needs for unity and the BJP's, there is an irreconcilable gulf. But on other matters, I respect him a great deal. He's brought a lot of energy to his job, and I'm very happy to show him that respect as and when appropriate. In this particular issue, I don't think there was any particular, shall we say, disagreement that I needed to conceal. I would not have gone and presented him a copy of the paradoxical Prime Minister, and he probably wouldn't have accepted it. But this book on British colonialism, why not?
Fair enough. Finally, do you think that there is an impatience in the new Indian, in today's Indian, at being sort of seen through and defined by the Western gaze? I think of what the Beeb sort of means today to Indians and what it may have meant 30 years ago. I also point to you, as you may well be aware, that the BBC is caught up in its own storm right now. Its chairman has been accused of a conflict of interest for getting the post in return for a loan he helped Boris Johnson secure. So within the UK, there's a great deal of debate, around the credibility, the independence, the integrity, the ideology of how the BBC is managed. I ask you this because I think the age of the foreign correspondent looking at the brown people may well be over.
Yes and no. You know what we are now trying to, we have two channels, WION and NDTV, that are trying to go international and to actually have an Indian perspective on world events and foreign news. At a time when the internet has brought us all so much closer to each other, where we are able to see what's going on half a world away, is it right for us to take a line that what's going on in our country is none of their business? I think increasingly, we are now, in fact, seeing more of the opposite, Barkha. We're talking about the fact where the world has become so small in people's imaginations that my right to comment on a riot in America is no lesser than an American's right to comment on a riot
This
in
is
my
true,
country.
but where do you see Indians going and making a film on abortion rights in America, or latent racism in the United Kingdom, or the gun culture? Every second day there's some crazy shootout. So it's that asymmetry of power, I think, Sir
Asymmetry of
John,
resources. Asymmetry of resources,
that
not
also.
necessarily of our having the rights to do that. I believe I have the right to comment on, say, racial discrimination in America, the right to comment on the vulnerability of British Labour Party politicians to the Pakistani vote in a number of their constituencies. Why should I not say? I have the opinions on all of this. I can comment on Russia's war in Ukraine. I can comment on Chinese domestic policy and how that affects their behavior on the border with us. I think the world has become like that, Barkha. And therefore, I am not prepared to denounce immediately a foreign journalist commenting on us. I think, in fact, even those who denounce the BBC are more concerned about the fact that the British sort of presumed, as it were, quote unquote, to investigate an internal event in India. But again, as we've talked about this, I don't want to repeat myself. It seems to me that we could have ignored that by simply saying they did something long time ago. They're now catching up with a story that we have already debated thoroughly and laid to rest. That could have been a more mature response moving on, rather than challenging their right. Because the moment we challenge their right, we're actually running in the face of the way in which the world has evolved in the 21st century. We are much more closely knit, much more aware of what's going on in other places. And I think we should not ourselves forfeit our right to comment on them by challenging their right to comment on us.
I think I would agree with that last point completely. It's an increasingly globalized world where we all see things through our national identity, but we all have the right to comment on our own issues as well as issues in other countries. Thank you, Shashi Tharoor. May there be many more politicians across parties that are willing to stand up for principles even when they're violated by their own ilk sometime. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. See you soon. And thanks for talking to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barkha. All the best. Jai.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.